The advertisement had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone white, like old scars. And Nora Voss had memorized it, not because she wanted to, but because her eyes kept finding it in the dark of her coat pocket when there was nothing else to find. Housekeeper wanted. Caldwell Mining Camp, Harlan County. Room and board provided. Wages negotiable. Must be capable and not given to complaint. Inquire R. Caldwell. She had read those last 4 words, not given to complaint, and understood them for what they were. A warning dressed as a requirement. She had folded the paper back along its ruined seams and put it in her pocket and taken the job anyway, because the alternative was her sister-in-law's spare room in Columbus, which smelled of cabbage and judgment in equal measure, and Nora had decided somewhere between her husband's grave and the train station that she would rather be cold and employed than warm and owed. That had been November. It was now the 2nd week of December, and the wagon that had collected her from the depot at Harlan was climbing a road that deserved the name only as a courtesy. 2 ruts carved into frozen mud, lined on either side by pine trees that stood so close and so dark, they seemed less like trees than like an audience that had stopped believing in the performance. The driver, a man named Ott, who had communicated his entire personality through a single nod at her arrival, had not spoken in 40 minutes. Nora did not mind. She watched the trees and kept her hands folded in her lap and thought about practical things. Whether the stove would draw properly, whether there was a root cellar, whether the nearest town had a dry goods store within reasonable distance. She did not let herself think about what else she knew of R. Caldwell. She knew it anyway. The woman at the depot, the station master's wife, who had the particular brightness of someone who considers gossip a civic duty, had told her while Ott loaded her trunk. 3 boys, she'd said. Oldest is nearly grown, and the other 2 are a handful, and the father, well... She'd made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He's had 4 housekeepers in 2 years, maybe 5. They don't stay. She'd looked at Nora with something between pity and appraisal. No offense meant, but you don't look like the type who'd last a winter. Nora had said, "Thank you for the information," and climbed into the wagon. She was thinking about that now. You don't look like the type. Not with offense, but with a kind of cold curiosity about what type the woman had imagined would last. Someone younger, perhaps. Someone softer, who would try to charm her way through it, and then be surprised when charm wasn't currency here. Or someone harder, who would meet Caldwell's reputation with her chin up and her sleeves rolled and make it a contest. Nora was neither of those things. She was simply a woman who had already lost everything that could be taken from her, and had therefore arrived at a particular variety of fearlessness that had nothing heroic in it, only arithmetic. The trees broke. The camp came into view below them as the road crested a ridge, and Nora looked at it without sentiment. It was a working place, not a pretty one. A main structure, the house, she supposed, though it had the proportions of something built in stages, each addition less considered than the last, sat at the center of a clearing that the snow had made temporarily honest. Behind it, further up the slope, the mine entrance showed as a black seam in the hillside, framed by timber supports and surrounded by the equipment of extraction. A rusted ore cart tipped on its side, a sluice box half dismantled, a heap of tailings gone gray and permanent. Between the house and the mine were the smaller buildings, a shed, a barn in better repair than the house, a structure she couldn't identify that had a stovepipe and might be a bunkhouse. There were no other workers visible. The camp had the silence of a place where the silence had been going on long enough to settle into the walls. Ott pulled the horses to a stop in front of the house and got down without ceremony. He lifted her trunk from the bed and set it in the snow and looked at her. "Someone'll be about," he said, which was more words than she'd gotten from him all journey, and climbed back up and turned the horses around. Nora stood in the snow with her trunk and her carpetbag and watched him go. Then she turned and looked at the house. It needed paint. The porch steps had a board gone soft on the left side. She could see the depression in it from here, the way the wood had begun to return to the earth. The curtains in the front window were closed, but one of them was caught on something and showed a triangle of dark interior. Smoke came from the chimney in a thin, pale line that told her the fire inside was not large. She picked up her carpetbag, left the trunk for the moment, and went up the porch steps, right side, avoiding the soft board, and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, 3 times, with the particular patience of someone who has learned that impatience costs more than it recovers. The door opened. The boy who opened it was perhaps 13, though hunger or hard living had made him difficult to age precisely. He was dark-haired and angular, with eyes the color of creek water in autumn, not quite brown, not quite green, and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized immediately because she had worn it herself. The expression of someone who has learned to assess a new person very quickly and has already begun to make their calculations. He said nothing. "I'm Nora Voss," she said. "I've come about the housekeeper position. Is your father home?" The boy studied her for a moment longer than was polite. Then he stepped back from the door, not quite an invitation, but not a refusal either, and Nora took it for what it was and stepped inside. The interior of the house struck her first as smell, wood smoke, and beneath it something soured, something left too long in a pot. And beneath that, the particular smell of a house where men have been living without attention, which is not the smell of dirt exactly, but of accumulation, of days laid down one on top of another without anyone lifting them away. The entryway opened directly into a main room that served as kitchen and sitting room both, with a table large enough for 5 pushed against the far wall, and a cook stove that was, as she'd suspected, not drawing well. The smoke had a slight backward curl to it that meant the flue needed cleaning. There were dishes on the table, not from a recent meal, from several meals, stacked and pushed aside in the manner of people who have stopped believing that order is recoverable. A coat had been thrown over the back of a chair and missed, and lay on the floor where it had fallen and been stepped around. The wood box beside the stove was down to 3 pieces. 2 more boys materialized from somewhere, a doorway, a shadow, and stood watching her. One was younger than the boy who'd opened the door, perhaps 9 or 10, with the same dark hair but rounder, less defended, his mouth slightly open. The other was older, 15 or 16, and had stationed himself against the far wall with his arms crossed, in a posture she recognized as performed indifference, which meant he was paying close attention. None of them spoke. Nora set her carpetbag down. She looked at the stove, at the wood box, at the dishes, at the 3 boys arranged around the room like furniture waiting to be moved. "Is there more wood outside?" she asked. The youngest one, the round-faced one, nodded. "Would you bring in 4 pieces, not 3, 4? He looked at the middle boy, the one who'd opened the door, as if checking whether this was permitted. The middle boy said nothing, but something shifted slightly in his face, and the youngest went. Nora unbuttoned her coat. She hung it on the hook beside the door, where there was a hook, and not on the chair, where there was not. And she rolled her sleeves to the elbow and looked at the oldest boy, still against the wall. "The flu," she said. "Does it always draw like that, or has it gotten worse recently?" A pause. He uncrossed his arms. "Worse," he said. "Past 2 weeks. There'll be a brush somewhere for cleaning it. Barn. I'll need it before I start supper." She looked at the dishes on the table. "And hot water." "Is there a pump inside or out?" "Out." "Right." She looked at the room once more, not with dismay, not with the theatrical sighing she had seen other women perform in difficult circumstances, as though suffering required an audience. She looked at it the way she looked at any problem, as a series of tasks arranged in order of necessity. The youngest came back with 4 pieces of wood and stood in the doorway holding them with the effortful dignity of a child trying to look capable. "Stack them in the box," Nora said. "Largest on the bottom." He did. She was filling the kettle from the bucket beside the door. There was a bucket, at least, which meant someone had been hauling water, even if they hadn't been doing much else, when the outside door opened and a man came in. She knew it was Caldwell before she turned around, not from any dramatic quality to his entrance, but from the way the 3 boys rearranged themselves slightly, the way objects in a room shift when the center of gravity changes. She turned around. He was perhaps 45, though the mountains had a way of adding years that weren't calendar years. He was large, not tall so much as broad, with the kind of physical density that comes from a life of extraction work, of pulling things out of the earth by force. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples, and his face was weathered into something past expression, the way stone weathers past detail. He was carrying his coat over one arm, and he stopped when he saw her, and looked at her with eyes that were very pale and very direct. He said, "You're the new one." "Nora Voss," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, the same assessing look his middle son had given her, she noticed, the same economy of it. And then he looked at the room, at the kettle in her hands, at the wood box with its 4 pieces, at the table with its stacked dishes. "I'll tell you what I told the others," he said. "You don't need to," Nora said. His eyes came back to her. "I know what you told them," she said. "I've heard it already. I'm not interested in your history with the others." She set the kettle on the stove. "I'm interested in whether there's a brush for the flu in the barn, or whether I need to send to town for one." The room was very quiet. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment, and she met it without performance, without softness, without the flinching that she suspected was what he was waiting for. "Barn," he said finally. "Left wall, hanging on a nail." "Thank you," Nora said, and turned back to the stove. She heard him move, the heavy footfall of him crossing to the far doorway, and then stop. She did not turn around. "Supper's at 6, he said. "The boys eat first." Nora said nothing, because she was already thinking about the flu and the dishes and the depleted woodbox and the sourness beneath the smoke that she hadn't yet identified but would, and because she had learned that some replies were best delivered not in words, but in the simple persistence of continuing to work. It was only later, when the house had quieted and she was alone in the small room off the kitchen that had been pointed out to her as hers, a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that faced the mine, that she let herself think about the oldest boy's face when she'd asked about the flu. The way he'd uncrossed his arms, the way the youngest had looked to his brother before he'd looked to her. They were waiting for her to leave, she realized. All three of them. They had learned to wait for it. She sat on the edge of the bed in her coat because the room was cold and she hadn't yet gotten a stove going in here. And she looked at the window and the darkness beyond it, and the faint orange seam at the mine entrance where someone had left a lamp burning. She was not going to leave. She had not decided this heroically. She had decided it the way she decided most things now, by calculating what she had left to lose, and finding the number very small, and proceeding accordingly. What she had not calculated, what she would not have thought to calculate on that first December evening, was the particular problem of three boys who had stopped believing in the permanence of anyone who came through that door, and what it would cost, slowly, over the long months of a mountain winter, to make them believe differently. She blew out the lamp. In the darkness, she could hear the house settling around her, the creak and shift of it. And beneath that, from somewhere above her, the room directly overhead, the sound of a boy's voice, low and uninflected, speaking words she couldn't make out. And then silence. And then the sound of it again. She would learn, by morning, that the middle boy's name was Thomas, that he was 12 and not 13, and that he had been the one keeping the others fed for the past 6 weeks. She would learn this not because anyone told her, but because she would find, tucked behind the flour sack in the pantry, a small notebook in a child's handwriting, with dates and quantities, half a can of beans, 3 potatoes, 1 heel of bread, recorded in the careful columns of someone who had learned to count what remained before it was gone. She would not mention the notebook, but she would not put it back. She set it on the kitchen table where he would know she had seen it, and waited to see what he would do. The door opened without a knock. Nora had not yet removed her coat. She had been standing at the kitchen table with her hand on the notebook, the small, careful thing with its columns of dates and quantities, and she had just enough time to register the sound of boots on the porch before the door swung inward and the cold came in ahead of the man who owned it. Callum Greer filled the door frame the way a cork fills a bottle, not by being large exactly, but by leaving no room around himself. He was broad through the shoulders and short through the neck, and he moved with the particular economy of a man who had spent 24 years in spaces where an unthought gesture could cost him a kneecap or a finger. He looked at her. He looked at the notebook on the table. He looked back at her. He did not speak. Nora had been warned about the silence. The station master's wife had mentioned it as one would mention a weather pattern, not dramatic, just a fact of the region, like frost in October. "He's not a talker," she'd said, which Nora had taken to mean merely that he was reserved. She understood now that this was a considerable understatement. Callum Greer's silence was not the silence of a man gathering words. It was the silence of a man who had decided, some years ago, that most words were unnecessary, and had not revised that position since. He crossed to the stove, checked the firebox. The fire Nora had coaxed to life an hour ago with wood she'd found stacked unevenly on the porch, green on the outside, dry enough in the middle if you split it, had settled into a steady burn. He noted this. He did not comment on it. "Mr. Greer," Nora said. He turned. His eyes were the color of creek water over slate. Not gray, not green, not quite either. He had a beard that had been trimmed at some point in the past month, and a cut above his left eyebrow that had healed badly, leaving a small white ridge in the skin. "You're Voss," he said. "I am." He looked at the notebook again. Then he took off his coat and hung it on the hook by the door, the only hook that held anything, the other three were bare, and said, "Boys'll be in before dark." That was all. He moved through the kitchen toward the back of the house, and she heard a door open and close, and then the sound of water being poured, and then nothing. Nora looked at the notebook. She looked at the door through which he had disappeared. She picked up the notebook, opened it to the first page, and read the first entry in full. December 3rd. Beans, half can. Bread, end piece. Potatoes, too small. Papa didn't eat. She closed it, set it back on the table, began to take inventory of the pantry. The boys came in the way water comes through a cracked wall, not all at once, but in a way that felt by the end as though they had always been there. The youngest arrived first. He was perhaps 7, with his father's coloring, and a gap where his left front tooth should have been. He stopped in the doorway and stared at Nora with the frank, undefended appraisal that only small children and very old people can manage without rudeness. "You're not Mrs. Aldrich," he said. "No," Nora agreed. She was at the stove, where a pot of dried beans had been soaking since she'd found them, and was now beginning, very slowly, to think about becoming edible. "I'm Mrs. Voss." "Mrs. Aldrich smelled like lavender." "I smell like wood smoke and a long wagon ride," Nora said. "You'll have to make do." The boy considered this. He climbed onto the bench at the kitchen table without being asked and sat with his elbows on the wood, watching her. "I'm Teddy," he said. "Hello, Teddy." "The beans aren't done yet," he observed. "They are not. We usually eat earlier." "You usually eat," Nora said, "whatever was quickest to open. I can see that from the state of the pantry." She said it without inflection, as a simple observation, the way one might note that a window was cracked or a hinge was loose. Teddy blinked at her. Then, apparently deciding she was not a threat, he picked up the small notebook from the table and turned it over in his hands. "You found Eli's book," he said. "I did." "He'll be mad." "Perhaps," Nora said. "Or perhaps he'll be relieved." Teddy thought about this with great seriousness. He was still thinking about it when the second boy came through the door. This one was 12 or 13, old enough to have acquired the particular wariness of a child who has been made responsible for things children should not be responsible for. He was thin in the way that had nothing to do with appetite and everything to do with allocation, the careful, considered thinness of someone who had been feeding others first. He looked at Nora. He looked at the notebook in Teddy's hands. Something moved across his face, not quite alarm, not quite relief, something in the narrow country between them. "That's mine," he said. "I know," Nora said. She turned from the stove. "You must be Eli." He did not confirm this. He crossed the room in 4 steps, took the notebook from Teddy with a practiced motion that was gentle enough not to be called snatching, and stood with it held against his chest, looking at her with the careful, measuring eyes of someone who had learned to assess new people quickly and had rarely been pleasantly surprised. "You read it," he said. "Yes." "You weren't supposed to." "No," Nora agreed. "I found it behind the flour sack. I should have put it back." She paused. "I didn't." Eli looked at her for a long moment. He was deciding something. She could see the mechanism of it working behind his eyes, the weighing and the sorting. He was, she thought, a very old 12. "The beans won't be ready for another hour," he said finally. "Closer to 2, Nora said. "But there's bread. I found yeast behind the loose board under the window. I don't know if you knew it was there. And I've had a loaf rising since I arrived." "It should be ready before the beans." Something in Eli's face shifted. Not warmth exactly. More like the slight release of a mechanism held too long under tension. "Papa doesn't like new bread," he said. "He says it sits wrong." "Then he can wait for the beans," Nora said. Eli looked at her again. Then, very carefully, he sat down at the table across from Teddy, set the notebook on the wood in front of him, and folded his hands on top of it. The third boy arrived with the dark. Nora heard him before she saw him. Boots heavier than a child's, a particular rhythm on the porch steps that was neither her employer's measured tread nor the quick, light step of the younger two. She was pulling the bread from the oven when the door opened, and she turned to find a boy of 15 or 16 standing in the threshold, looking at her with an expression she recognized immediately and without warmth. He had his father's build, already broad, still growing into it, and his mother's coloring, if the woman in the single photograph she'd noticed above the mantel was indeed his mother. Dark hair, a complexion that would have been striking in better light. He was, she thought, the kind of boy who would become a handsome man if he survived his own anger long enough to arrive there. "Who said you could touch that bread?" he said. "No one," Nora said. "I made it." "We had bread." "You had the heel of a loaf from 4 days ago," Nora said. She set the pan on the stovetop and reached for the cloth to wrap the handle. Teddy was using it to hold down a page in his primer. The boy's jaw moved. "I do the cooking." "I know," Nora said. She turned to face him fully. "And you've done it well, by the evidence of your brothers." She paused. "But it isn't your job anymore." "I decide what's my job." "You're—" She glanced at Eli, who gave her the name with his eyes before she had to ask. "You're Cade." He didn't answer. "Cade," she said again, not as a question. "The bread is done. There's a pot of beans that needs another 40 minutes. There's a ham bone in the pot with them, and I found enough onion in the cold cellar to make them worth eating." She turned back to the stove. "Sit down or don't. But the bread is for the table, and the table is where I'll put it." The silence behind her was of a different quality than his father's. Callum Greer's silence was settled, geological. The silence of a man who had long since made his peace with stillness. Cade's silence was pressurized, the silence of something that had not yet decided whether to remain contained. She heard him, after a long moment, pull out the bench and sit. Callum Greer came to the table when she set the beans out. He sat at the head, looked at the bread, looked at the beans, looked briefly at Nora, who was filling bowls at the stove with her back to him, and not, she was quite certain, going to ask whether everything was to his satisfaction. She set a bowl in front of Teddy, set one in front of Eli, set one in front of Cade, who looked at it, and then at her, and then away. She set the last bowl at the foot of the table, the only remaining place, and sat down. The four of them looked at one another across the length of the table. Callum Greer picked up his spoon. Teddy, she noticed, waited. Eli waited. Cade waited. They were watching her, not their father, not the food, watching her with a collective attention she could not immediately parse. Then Teddy picked up his spoon, and Eli picked up his, and Cade, after a moment in which he seemed to weigh the cost of the gesture against the cost of refusing it, picked up his. They ate. The bread was good. She knew it was good without vanity, the way a craftsperson knows their work. Teddy ate 2 pieces. Eli ate 1.5, and then looked at the remainder of the loaf as though calculating something. Cade said nothing, and ate everything in his bowl, and did not ask for more, which she noted. Callum Greer ate without speaking, without looking up, and when he finished he set his spoon down and pushed back from the table and said, "Adequate," and left the room. Nora looked at the 3 boys. Teddy was grinning. Eli was watching the door through which his father had disappeared with an expression she couldn't read. Cade was looking at his empty bowl. "He said that to Mrs. Aldrich once," Teddy offered. She cried. "I'm not Mrs. Aldrich," Nora said. She began to gather the bowls. "He hasn't said adequate about supper in a long time," Eli said quietly. Nora paused. She looked at the boy, at the notebook which he had set beside his bowl and which he had not, she noticed, put back in his pocket. She said nothing. She carried the bowls to the basin and began to wash them, and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her, the fire, the wind off the mountain, the quiet movements of 3 boys who had not, until tonight, had anyone to sit down with them. She was almost finished when she heard it, a sound from above, from the room at the top of the stairs where the light had been burning since before supper. Not a voice, not a footstep, a cough, and then another, and then the specific, terrible silence that follows a sound a man has been trying not to make. Nora set down the bowl she was holding. She looked at Eli. Eli was already looking at her. "How long?" she said. He knew what she was asking. She could see that he knew. He had known someone would ask eventually, and he had been dreading it and, perhaps in some small, exhausted part of himself, waiting for it. "Since October," he said. The cough did not come again that night. Nora stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long moment after she heard it, her hand resting on the newel post, which was loose in its socket and tilted slightly toward her as though leaning in confidence. She listened to the silence above, the particular silence of a person going still, of breath being managed, of a body making itself quiet through effort rather than ease. She knew that silence. She had sat beside it for 11 months before Thomas died. She went back to the kitchen. Eli was still at the table, the notebook closed in front of him now, his hands flat on either side of it, like he was holding something down. Teddy had fallen asleep in the chair by the stove, his head tipped sideways at an angle that would pain him in the morning, one sock half off his foot. The fire had settled into a steady, even burn. The kitchen smelled of onion and black pepper, and something beneath that, the ghost of old grease, of meals made in haste and without care. "Does he see a doctor?" Nora asked. "There's one in Harlan," Eli said. "He went in September." "And?" The boy's jaw moved. He was 12 years old, and he was choosing his words with the deliberateness of a much older person, a person who had learned that some words, once released, could not be recalled. "The doctor said it wasn't the dust yet. Said it was coming, but it wasn't there yet." He paused. "Papa didn't go back." Nora pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She did not speak immediately. She looked at the boy, at the careful blankness of his face, at the effort that blankness required. And she thought about what it meant to be 12 years old and keeping records of what your family ate, and knowing your father had a cough that had been worsening since October, and writing none of that down because some things are too large to fit in a notebook. "All right," she said. "All right?" He looked at her with something that was almost suspicion. "All right," she said again. "I heard it. Now I know. That's all I meant." She rose, covered the leftover soup, banked the stove, and lifted Teddy from the chair with a grunt of effort. The boy was heavier than he looked, all loose limbs and dead weight, and carried him toward the stairs. Eli followed without being asked, which told her something. He was accustomed to the end of the evening. He knew his part in it. She did not meet Ellis until the following morning. She had heard him the night before, heard his door open and close, heard the measured tread of his footsteps overhead, heard the pause at the top of the stairs that had lasted nearly a full minute before retreating. He had not come down. Whether this was deliberate or merely the result of some private calculation she could not determine, but she suspected it was both. He appeared at 6:15 while she was at the stove, when the light outside was still gray and thin, and the frost on the window made the world look like something seen through old glass. She heard him on the stairs, a different step than Eli's, heavier, more deliberate, and then he was in the doorway. He was tall for 13, not in the way that boys are sometimes suddenly tall, all awkward height and unfinished edges, but in a way that suggested he had been growing steadily and without interruption toward something specific, some particular version of himself he was already partway to becoming. He had his father's coloring, dark hair, dark eyes, a face that kept its own counsel. But there was something in the set of his mouth that was different, something that had learned to hold. He looked at her. He looked at the stove. He looked at the table where she had set 3 places for breakfast, and at the bowl of cornmeal mush she had prepared, and at the coffee she had found at the back of the pantry and coaxed into something drinkable. He took all of this in with the slow, thorough attention of someone conducting an inspection. "Ellis," she said, "I'm Nora Voss." "I know who you are," he said. His voice was even, not rude, not warm, calibrated. "Sit down, then." He did not sit. He moved to the far side of the kitchen, to the hook near the back door where his coat hung, and he lifted it down and began to put it on. "I've got chores," he said. "The chores will keep 5 minutes. The mush won't." He looked at her then, a direct, measuring look that she suspected had sent previous women reaching for their composure. She met it without difficulty. "I eat after," he said. "I always have." "After what?" "After the horses, after the wood, after I check the—" He stopped himself. He had been about to say something more, and he had decided not to. "After my chores." "Then I'll keep it warm," Nora said, and turned back to the stove. She heard him pause. She heard the specific quality of a silence that contains surprise, a brief rearrangement, a recalibration. He had expected, she understood, either argument or capitulation. She had offered neither. The back door opened and closed. Teddy ate with great enthusiasm, and no conversation beyond a series of observations about the mush, that it was better than the mush Eli made, that Eli's mush always had lumps, that he himself didn't mind lumps, but that Ellis minded them very much and had once refused to eat an entire pot on account of lumps. And did Nora know how to make biscuits, because the last woman had made biscuits on her first day, and Ellis had eaten 4 of them, which was the most Ellis had eaten at one sitting in a long time. Nora filed this information away without comment. Eli ate quietly and read from a school book he had propped against the sugar tin. He had good manners, not the performed manners of a child who had been drilled, but the natural, unself-conscious courtesy of one who simply preferred things done properly. He passed the salt before she asked for it. He refilled his own cup and glanced at hers. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, as though this were a transaction completed. Ellis came in at 7:30. His boots were wet from the snow, and he knocked them against the doorframe before entering, which she noted. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat down. She set the bowl in front of him. It was warm. She had kept it on the back of the stove in a pan of water, and it was the same temperature it had been 40 minutes ago, or close enough. He looked at it. He picked up his spoon. She was at the counter with her back to him, beginning the work of taking stock of what she would need from town. There would need to be a conversation with Callum Greer about money and supplies, a conversation she was not anticipating with any particular pleasure, when he said, without preamble, "The woman before you lasted 9 days. She did not turn around. "So I've been told." "The one before her lasted 3 weeks. She cried at supper on the last night, and Papa told her to leave the table." A pause. "He didn't mean it the way it sounded. He's not." He stopped. "I'm not worried about your father," Nora said. "You should be." She turned then. He was looking at her steadily, the spoon in his hand, the mush untouched. His face was still doing that careful, calibrated thing, but beneath it she could see something else, something that was not quite a warning and not quite a plea, but occupied the uneasy territory between them. "I'm not running anyone off," she said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not here to replace anything or to rearrange what you've made of this house, or to insert myself where I'm not wanted. I'm here because you need someone to cook and clean and keep things in order, and that is what I intend to do." Ellis said nothing. "But I will tell you," she continued, "because I think you're old enough to be told plainly. This house is not in order. The pantry is nearly empty." "Your brother has been keeping meal records in a notebook like a man managing a failing account, which means he's been frightened about food, and a 12-year-old should not be frightened about food. Your father has a cough he's been hiding since October, and nobody in this house seems to have decided what to do about that." She paused. "I am not saying these things to alarm you. I'm saying them because you already know them, and it seems to me that you've been carrying them alone for long enough." Something moved across his face. It was brief, a compression, a tightening around the eyes, and then it was gone, locked back behind that careful, practiced stillness. "You don't know anything about this house," he said. His voice had gone flat in a way that was different from its previous evenness. There was something in it now, something with edges. "No," she agreed. "Not yet." "Or this family." "No." "Then don't—" He stopped. He set his spoon down on the table. "Don't act like you do." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved against the window. Somewhere in the house, a board settled with the cold. "Ellis," she said, "how long since someone asked you how you were?" The question landed differently than she had intended, or perhaps exactly as she had intended. She was not certain. She watched him absorb it. She watched the careful blankness falter just briefly, like a flame in a draught that recovers but is not quite the same afterward. He pushed back from the table. He stood. He picked up his bowl, still full, and carried it to the counter and set it down beside the basin, and then he put his coat back on and went out the back door, and the cold came in behind him and then was shut out again, and the kitchen was quiet. Nora stood where she was. She let out a slow breath. Teddy appeared in the doorway from the hall, still in his socks, having apparently witnessed at least the ending of this exchange. He looked at the door. He looked at Nora. "He does that," Teddy said. "He goes out when things get—" He made a vague gesture with one hand that seemed to encompass a great deal. "I know," Nora said. She picked up Ellis's bowl, covered it, and put it back on the warm part of the stove. She was still there, making her list of supplies, when she heard it. Not from upstairs this time, but from the hall. The particular sound of a door she hadn't yet opened at the far end of the passage, where the floorboards were darkest and the wallpaper had begun to separate from the plaster. A door that, when she had passed it yesterday, had been closed in a way that suggested it was always closed. It opened now, and the footsteps that came down the hall toward the kitchen were not the footsteps of any of the boys. The footsteps were deliberate, not heavy, not the boot fall of a working man, but measured in a way that suggested a person who had once moved quickly and now chose not to. Nora set down her pencil. She did not turn immediately. She had learned, in the 2 days she had been in this house, that the manner in which she received a thing often determined the shape it would take. When she did turn, she found Callum Greer standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He was dressed for the mine, canvas jacket, trousers tucked into laced boots already dulled with old dust. But he had not yet put on his outer coat, and there was something unfinished about him in that state, something that suggested he had come here first for a reason and was still deciding whether to name it. He looked at the table. He looked at the stove. His gaze moved across the room with the same silent accounting she had seen in Ellis, and she understood then that the boy had learned it from watching his father. "There's coffee," Nora said. He looked at her then. His eyes were dark and still, the eyes of a man who had trained himself out of readable expression the way you train a dog out of a bad habit, systematically, over years, until the original impulse is buried so deep even the animal forgets it was there. "I don't take it before shift," he said. "All right." She turned back to her list. She heard him move to the stove anyway, not for the coffee, but to check the damper, the way a man checks a thing he has always checked because he does not yet believe someone else will do it correctly. She let him check it. She did not comment. "Ellis eat?" "His bowl is covered on the back of the stove. He said he eats after chores." A pause. "That's right. I kept it warm for him." Another pause. Longer. She heard him set down whatever he had picked up, the damper key, perhaps, or the lid of the firebox. "The other ones," he said. "They complained about it. Said a boy ought to eat when the food was ready." "Food stays warm," Nora said. "Boys don't always." She was not sure why she said it. It was not a calculated thing. It came out the way practical observations sometimes do, plain and without decoration, and she heard the silence that followed it as a kind of measurement, the house taking her dimensions. Callum Greer said. It was not agreement. It was not dismissal. It was the sound a man makes when something has landed in a place he didn't expect it to land. He left without further conversation. She heard the back door, the particular complaint of its hinge, and then the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground fading toward the mine road. Nora exhaled. She picked up her pencil. Tobias Greer arrived in the kitchen at 8:30, which was later than Teddy and earlier than Ellis. And he arrived in the particular way of a child who has been standing outside the door for some time before committing to entry. Nora heard him in the hall, the small shifts of weight, the almost creak of a floorboard tested and then relieved. And she did not look up from the bread dough she was working. She had found a crock of starter behind the flour barrel, still viable, which told her something about the household's former life that its current state did not. "There's porridge on the stove," she said, "and the bread won't be ready until noon, so don't ask." A pause. Then, "How'd you know I was there?" "I have ears." Tobias came into the kitchen the way water finds its level, not rushing, but filling the available space with a kind of inevitable ease. He was 9 years old and built like a question mark, all forward lean and wide eyes, his dark hair growing out at an angle that suggested someone had cut it some months ago and then lost interest in the project. He was wearing one boot and carrying the other, and he set the carriage boot on the table with the unconscious confidence of a child who has not yet been told often enough to take his things off the table. Nora looked at the boot. She looked at him. "Floor," she said. He put it on the floor. Then he sat down across from her workspace and watched her knead the dough with the frank, assessing gaze she had noticed in him yesterday. The gaze of a child who had not yet learned that staring was considered rude in company, or who had learned it and decided the information was less interesting than whatever he was looking at. "You're doing it different than Mama did," he said. Nora kept her hands moving. "Different how?" "She used to fold it, like this." He demonstrated with his hands, a folding motion, pressing the heels of his palms together. "You're pushing." "Both work," Nora said. "Folding makes a tighter crumb. Pushing makes a softer one." He considered this. "Which is better?" "Depends what you want the bread for." "Eating," he said, with the mild impatience of someone who feels the answer should have been obvious. Nora turned the dough. Then, softer. He watched her for another moment. Then, "Ellis says you're not going to last." "Does he?" "He says they all leave. He said Mrs. Hartwick lasted the longest, and she left in March because Papa—" He stopped. He had the look of a child who has run slightly ahead of himself and is now reassessing the terrain. "Because of something." "Because of something," Nora agreed. "Don't you want to know what?" "Not particularly." This appeared to genuinely surprise him. He sat back slightly, recalibrating. "Why not?" "Because whatever it was between your father and Mrs. Hartwick. It doesn't have much to do with me." "But what if he does the same thing to you?" Nora dusted the dough with a little more flour and pressed the heel of her hand into it. "Then I'll deal with it when it happens. I don't find much use in worrying over things that haven't occurred yet." Tobias was quiet for a moment. It was a different quality of quiet than Ellis's silences. Not guarded, but processing, the way a child goes quiet when they are genuinely chewing on something. "Teddy likes you," he said finally. "Teddy's easy to like things." "He didn't like Mrs. Hartwick." "He cried when she first came." A pause. "He cried when she left, too, though. So maybe that doesn't tell you much." "Maybe not." He got up and went to the stove and served himself the porridge, which Nora noted without comment that he did it himself without being asked or directed, with the quiet competence of a child who has been feeding himself for longer than he should have needed to. He brought the bowl back to the table and sat down again and ate 3 spoonfuls before he spoke. "It's better than Ellis makes it," he said. "That's not a high bar," Nora said. "Ellis makes it with water and no salt." Tobias looked up. "How do you know?" "Your brother keeps records." Something moved across his face, recognition, and something more complicated underneath it. "You found his book." "He left it in the pantry." "He was keeping track," Tobias said. He looked down at his bowl. "After Mama died, nobody was really. Ellis said we had to know what we had. He said we couldn't just eat without keeping track or we'd run out and not know it was coming." He stirred the porridge slowly. "Papa didn't eat much anyway." "But Ellis said we still had to know." Nora shaped the dough into its loaf and set it to rise. She wiped her hands on her apron. She did not say anything about what he had just told her because there was nothing to say that would improve it, and she had learned long ago that the impulse to comfort was often more about the comforter than the comforted. Instead, she said, "Is there anything you need for school this week?" He looked up again, and the expression on his face was one she recognized. The expression of a child who has been asked a practical question in the middle of an emotional one, and who is relieved by the change in weather. "My arithmetic primer's got a torn cover," he said. "I've been holding it with a piece of twine. I'll see what I can find." He ate the rest of his porridge. He was halfway to the door, boot in hand again, when he stopped and turned back. She had seen this coming, had felt it building in him the way weather builds, the particular pressure of a question that has been held too long. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Tobias?" He looked at her with those frank, unguarded eyes. "Do you sit down for meals?" The other ones, they mostly ate in the kitchen by themselves. After we were done, Mrs. Hartwick said it wasn't proper for the housekeeper to sit with the family. Nora looked at him steadily. "Do you want me to sit with you?" He looked at the floor. He looked at his boot. He was 9 years old, and the question had cost him something to ask, and she understood that the cost was not embarrassment, but the older, quieter ache of a child who has wanted something for a long time and has learned to expect the answer no. "Teddy does," he said carefully. "He hasn't said so, but he does." "And you?" A pause so brief it might have been missed. "Yes, ma'am." "Then I'll sit," Nora said. "Starting tonight." He left. She heard him on the stairs, both boots now, the even thump of a boy with somewhere to be, and then the front door, and then the cold outside swallowing the sound of him. She stood in the kitchen alone and looked at the loaf she had shaped and thought about Ellis, who had eaten his breakfast cold and alone before dawn rather than sit at a table with her. She thought about the covered bowl on the back of the stove, and the way Callum Greer had checked the damper without comment, and the particular sound of that far door opening in the hall before he appeared. A door she had not yet tried, in a part of the house where the wallpaper was separating from the plaster. She had said she would sit at dinner. Ellis would not like it. She was still considering the shape of that particular problem when she heard the front door open again, not with the energy of a boy returning for a forgotten thing, but slowly, with purpose, and the footsteps in the hall were Ellis's footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, and they stopped just outside the kitchen. She waited. He did not come in. "Your breakfast is on the stove," she said. A silence. Then, "Toby talked to you?" "He had his porridge and went to school." Another silence, longer. She heard him breathe once, a controlled, considered sound. "He asks too many questions." "He's 9, Nora said. "It's his job." The silence that followed was of a different texture than the ones before it. Not the silence of a boy deciding whether to enter, but the silence of a boy who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to deliver it. "I know what he asked you," Ellis said through the wall. "And I know what you said." Nora said nothing. "It won't work," Ellis said. "Whatever you think you're doing." She turned to face the doorway. He was standing just outside it, still in his coat, and the look on his face was not the cold assessment she had seen at breakfast. It was something rawer, something that had been covered over and had worn thin in one place, the way a coat wears thin at the elbow. He was 15 years old, and he was afraid of her. Not of her, exactly, of what she represented, of the particular gravity of a woman who sat down to eat. "I'm making bread," Nora said, "and I'll sit at supper. You can eat with us or you can eat after. Either way, the food will be there." His jaw tightened. He looked like his father in that moment, the same trained stillness, the same buried thing. "You won't be here in March," he said. "It's December," said Nora. "I've got time." He took his bowl from the stove and left the kitchen without another word, and she heard him go up the stairs and close his door, and the house settled back into its particular silence. She looked at the loaf rising under its cloth. She thought about what Tobias had said. Ellis said we had to know what we had. And she thought about a 15-year-old boy taking inventory of his family's survival, writing it down in a small notebook in careful columns because someone had to and no one else would. She thought about the far door in the hall, the one that had been closed in a way that suggested it was always closed. The one Callum Greer had come through this morning without explanation. She had not asked. She had told herself it was none of her business, that she would not go looking for things that hadn't been offered. But that evening, when she went to bank the stove and check the latch on the back window, the one that didn't quite catch, she found herself standing in the hallway looking at the far door. There was a smell coming from beneath it. Not rot, not damp, though there was damp in this house everywhere. Something else. Something medicinal, and underneath that, something older. She put her hand flat against the wood. She did not open it. But she stood there long enough to understand that whatever was behind that door was the true center of this household, the still point around which everything else, the cold breakfasts and the covered bowls, and the small boy asking whether she would sit down, was slowly, carefully orbiting. The door stayed closed. Nora pulled her hand back, dried it on her apron as though she had touched something wet, and returned to the kitchen. There was bread to finish. There were 3 pairs of socks she had found in the mending basket, each with a heel worn so thin it was more intention than fabric. There was supper to plan from a pantry that had improved in 2 weeks from desperate to merely sparse. She had learned in the months since Thomas died that work was not distraction. People said that. "Keep yourself busy, Nora. Keep your hands moving." As though grief were a dog that could be outrun. It wasn't. Work was simply the structure inside which grief could be carried without spilling. She understood the difference. She suspected that somewhere in this house, 3 boys understood it too, though they had no words for it yet. She went back to her bread. Samuel found her that afternoon. She had not been formally introduced to the youngest Greer boy. He had appeared at the edges of her first days the way weather appears, present, then absent, then present again, without announcement or explanation. She had noticed him watching from doorways. She had noticed the way he stopped moving when she moved, the way a small animal stops when something larger crosses its path. Not from fear, exactly, but from the instinct to assess. He was 5 years old. She knew this from the notebook, from Eli's careful records. Samuel, born March 1881, likes porridge if there is enough sugar, does not like the dark. He came into the kitchen while she was kneading and stood at the far end of the work table, close enough to see her hands, but far enough to retreat without embarrassment if she acknowledged him too directly. She did not acknowledge him too directly. She kept her eyes on the dough and said, "There's a stool under that table if you want to sit." A pause. Then the sound of the stool being dragged out, its legs scraping the stone floor. She kept kneading. He sat. For a while there was only the sound of the dough and the fire. The afternoon light through the kitchen window was the flat, gray light of January, the kind that made everything look like it was waiting for permission to become something else. "What are you making?" Samuel said. "Bread. We had bread yesterday. You'll have it again today." Another pause. He was watching her hands. She could feel it, the way children watched hands when they were learning how the world worked. Not the words, but the doing. "Eli makes bread sometimes," he said. "It doesn't look like that." "Eli does a fine job," Nora said. "Different hands make different bread." "Does it taste different?" "A little. Not in a way that matters." She could feel him considering this, filing it away somewhere in the serious interior of a 5-year-old mind. "Are you going to leave?" he said. She did not stop kneading. She had learned already that the Greer boys asked their hardest questions sideways, without looking at you, without any preamble, the way people ask questions when they have asked them before and received bad answers. "Not today," she said. "Mrs. Harlan left on a Tuesday," Samuel said. "She didn't say she was going. She just wasn't there in the morning. Eli made porridge." "Eli seems capable." "He cried," Samuel said, with the plain, unsentimental accuracy of a child reporting facts. "He thought I didn't see. I was under the table." Nora pressed the heel of her hand into the dough, folded it, pressed again. "People cry," she said. "It doesn't mean something is wrong with them." "Papa doesn't." She said nothing to that. It did not seem like a statement that wanted a response. It seemed like a statement that had been held for a long time, and had finally found a place to be set down, even temporarily. Samuel slid off the stool and came around to her side of the table. He was small for 5. She had thought he was perhaps 4 when she first saw him, with dark eyes that were too old for his face, and hair that wanted cutting badly. He stood beside her and looked at the dough. "Can I touch it?" "Wash your hands first." He went to the basin without argument. She heard him splash water, heard the rough sound of him drying his hands on the towel she had hung there. He came back and she tore a small piece of dough from the edge of the mass and set it on the table in front of him. He pressed his finger into it. It gave, and he made a small sound of surprise. "It pushes back," he said. "It does." "Why?" "Because there's air inside it. You're learning to put air into it when you need. That's what makes bread bread instead of paste." He pressed the dough again, watching it spring back slowly. His face had the concentrated gravity of a scientist observing a phenomenon. "Eli said you're going to stay until spring," Samuel said. "That's the arrangement." "And then?" She looked at him then, sideways, because he was still looking at the dough. He was 5 years old, and he was asking her to promise something she could not promise, in the only language he had available to him, which was the language of and then, and then, and then. "I don't know what happens in spring," she said, which was the truest thing she could offer. He accepted this with a small nod, the way people accept true things that are not what they hoped for. At supper that evening it happened. She had not planned it. She did not think, afterward, that it could have been planned, that it was the kind of thing that either happens or doesn't, depending on some alignment of circumstance and exhaustion and the particular quality of a January evening in a cold house. She had made soup from the ham bones she'd found at the back of the cold larder, and the dried beans she'd soaked the night before, with the last of the onions and some dried thyme that had been on the shelf so long it barely smelled of anything. She had made the bread. She had set the table for 3, as she had been doing. The boys ate at the kitchen table. Callum Greer ate at whatever hour he returned from the mine, which was not a supper hour, and she herself had been eating standing at the counter after they were done, which was her habit and her preference, and had not yet been remarked upon. The boys came in, Ellis first, then Tobias, then Samuel trailing behind, still in the coat he'd worn outside, which she would have to remind him to hang. They sat. She set the soup in front of them. She turned back to the stove. "Miss Nora," Samuel said. She turned. He was sitting with his hands in his lap, not touching his spoon. He was looking at the empty place at the end of the table, the place that was not set, that had no bowl, that had no chair pulled out. "Aren't you going to sit down?" he said. She looked at the table. She looked at the 3 of them, Ellis with his careful, watchful expression, Tobias with his spoon already halfway to his bowl and now suspended, waiting, Samuel with his hands in his lap and his question hanging in the air between them. "I'll eat after," she said. "We want you to sit down," Samuel said. It was the "we" that stopped her. Not the request. She had managed requests, deflected them, rerouted them. It was the "we," the way he'd said it with the absolute certainty of a child who has not yet learned to hedge, who had not consulted his brothers, but had simply spoken for them because to him it was obvious. It was already decided. It was simply a matter of saying it. She looked at Ellis. Ellis looked back at her. His jaw worked once, slightly. He said nothing, but he did not contradict his brother. She looked at Tobias. Tobias set his spoon down. "There's room," he said, which was practical and 9 years old. And also, she understood, everything. She got a bowl. She got a spoon. She pulled out the chair at the end of the table, and she sat down. She ladled soup into her bowl. The 3 of them began to eat. No one said anything about it. It was not the kind of moment that wanted words laid over it. It was quiet, and it was ordinary, and it was— she recognized this even as it was happening, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have lost enough to know what things are worth. It was not ordinary at all. She was washing the bowls when she heard Callum Greer's step on the porch. He came in the way he always came in, with the mine still on him. The cold, the dark, the particular silence of a man who had spent 10 hours underground. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She did not turn around. "There's soup on the stove," she said. "Bread in the cloth." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him move to the stove, heard the ladle against the pot. "Samuel asleep?" he said. "An hour ago." Another pause. She dried the last bowl and set it on the shelf. "He was in the kitchen all afternoon," Callum said. It was not quite a question. "He was." She heard him settle at the table, not the kitchen table where the boys had eaten, but the chair near the stove that was his chair, the one that had been his chair before she arrived and would be his chair after. She heard the sound of a man eating alone, which was a particular sound, different from the sound of people eating together. She had lived with that sound for 8 months after Thomas died. She knew its dimensions. "He doesn't usually do that," Callum said. "No," she agreed. "I don't think he usually does." She folded the dishcloth. She was about to say good night. She had learned to read the shape of their conversations, to feel where they ended, when Callum spoke again. "He asked me once," Callum said, "what his mother smelled like." She went still. "I couldn't—" He stopped. She heard him set his spoon down. "I couldn't remember," he said, and his voice had something in it that she recognized, not because she had heard it from him before, but because she had heard it from herself in the first months, when she had stood in her own kitchen and tried to remember the exact sound of Thomas's laugh, and found only a general impression, a shape without detail. The horror of that, the specific, terrible horror of forgetting. She did not turn around. She did not trust herself to turn around. "Good night, Mr. Greer," she said quietly, and left the kitchen. She was halfway up the stairs when she heard it, a sound from the far room, the room with the medicinal smell, the room she had not opened. Not a voice, not a cough. Something being moved, something heavy, dragged across a floor. She stopped on the stair. The sound stopped. She stood in the dark and understood, with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the January air coming through the gaps in the walls, that whatever was behind that door was not simply a room, it was a reason, and someone in this house was keeping it from her deliberately. She went to bed. She did not sleep. In the morning, the youngest boy would not meet her eyes. The morning after she had stood on the stair and listened to the dark, Nora went to town. She told herself it was for flour. The bin was low enough to justify it. She had been stretching the last of it with cornmeal, and there was no shame in that. But the bread had gone dense, and the boys had eaten it without complaint, which was almost worse than complaining. Children who had stopped expecting better were children who had been disappointed past the point of protest. She told herself it was for flour. It was not only for flour. The road to Garnet Creek was frozen solid, which made the walking easier than it had been in December when she arrived through mud that had tried to claim her boots at every step. Now the ruts were locked in place, permanent seeming, and she walked in them with her coat buttoned to the throat and her breath coming in small white clouds that dissolved before her. She had left the boys their breakfast. Ellis had taken his from the warming shelf without acknowledgement, which was his way, and she had made her peace with it. Eli had eaten standing, watching her from beneath the fringe of his dark hair, with an expression she could not yet read. Not suspicion, exactly, but something close to calculation, as though he were perpetually deciding how much to trust her with. Samuel had not come down. She had knocked at his door. She had said, "Breakfast is ready. Come when you are ready." She had not pushed. She had not pushed because she was afraid of what he might say if she did, and she was not accustomed to being afraid of a 5-year-old's honesty. Agnes Tully's dry goods store occupied the corner of Garnet Creek's main thoroughfare with the settled authority of a building that has never doubted its own necessity. It was not large, but it was organized with a precision that suggested its proprietress considered disorder a form of moral failure. Bolts of fabric stood in ranked rows. Tins were labeled in a hand so clear it might have been typeset. The floor had been swept within recent memory, which was more than could be said for most of the buildings Nora had encountered in this part of the county. The woman behind the counter was 60-something, broad-shouldered, with silver hair pinned so firmly to her head that it appeared structural. She wore a canvas apron and was tallying a column of figures in a ledger, and she did not look up immediately when Nora pushed through the door. This, Nora understood, was not rudeness. It was a form of assessment. The deliberate pause of a woman who preferred to know who she was dealing with before she committed herself to an expression. When Agnes Tully did look up, her eyes were dark and sharp and not unkind. "Mrs. Voss," she said. Nora stopped. "You know me." "I processed the advertisement." Agnes set down her pen with the care of someone who keeps her instruments in good order. "R. Caldwell, housekeeper wanted, December start. I know everyone who comes through that advertisement, and I know everyone who stays." A pause waited. "Most don't." "So I've been told." "You've been there 6 weeks.
7, Nora said, as of yesterday.
Agnes studied her. Not unkindly. That word kept applying itself, and Nora decided it was the most accurate available. There was nothing cruel in Agnes Tully's scrutiny. There was only the unsentimental attention of a woman who had spent decades watching people arrive in difficult circumstances and had developed a reliable sense of what those circumstances were likely to produce. "Flour," Nora said, "and salt pork if you have it. The boys need more fat in their diet than they've been getting." "£25 or 50? "50. Agnes moved to fill the order without further comment. But the silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that precedes a thing being said. "The eldest," Agnes said, her back still turned, lifting the flour sack with the ease of long practice. "Ellis. He came in here in November, just before Callum posted the advertisement. Bought a tin of tobacco he couldn't afford and didn't smoke, and stood at that counter for 20 minutes telling me his father didn't need help running the household." She set the flour on the counter and met Nora's eyes. "He was 15 years old, and he had been cooking for 3 younger brothers and a man who won't ask for anything. And he stood there and told me they were managing fine." Nora said nothing. "I gave him the tobacco," Agnes said. "Didn't charge him. And I posted the advertisement the following week, because someone had to." The salt pork came out from the cold room wrapped in brown paper. Agnes set it beside the flour and began to calculate the total, though her eyes had not fully left Nora's face. "There's a room," Nora said. She had not planned to say it. It came out of her the way things come out when you have been holding them in the cold for 7 weeks and suddenly find yourself in a warm room with another woman who knows things. "On the upper floor. He keeps it locked. Or not locked. I haven't tried the door. But closed. And there's a smell."
Agnes's hands went still on the ledger.
Medicinal,
Nora said.
and something else underneath it. Something I recognize.
She paused.
I was married to a man who died of a lung condition. I know what that smell is.
The store was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through Garnet Creek with a sound like something being swept away.
Callum Greer,
Agnes said carefully.
has not spoken about his health to anyone in this town.
Not to the company doctor, not to the minister, not to me. And I have known that man since he came here 18 years ago with a wife and a baby, and more optimism than this county generally permits. She closed the ledger. What I know from other sources. What I know is that he went to a doctor in Harlan in September. What I know is that he came back and posted that advertisement within the month. Nora felt the cold settle into her chest.
He's dying.
Agnes did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer. He's ill, she said finally. The nature and the pace of it, that I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that a man who drives off 4 housekeepers in 2 years and then suddenly accepts the 5th one and stops fighting her presence is a man who has decided something. She looked at Nora steadily. And I don't think what he's decided is that he's going to get better. The walk back was longer than the walk in. The flour was heavy, and the salt pork swung against her hip with each step, and the road was the same frozen road it had been that morning, but it seemed to her that the ruts were deeper now, the sky lower, the distance between the camp and the rest of the world more absolute. She had asked Agnes one more question before she left. The boys, she had said, do they know? Agnes had considered this for a longer time than Nora had expected. Eli knows, she had said, or suspects, which in a child of that age amounts to the same thing. He's been keeping that notebook since summer. She thought about the notebook. She thought about Eli's careful columns of figures, meals recorded, provisions tracked, a 12-year-old's attempt to impose legibility on a household that was coming apart at its foundations. Not the behavior of a child managing a temporary inconvenience. The behavior of a child preparing for something. She thought about Samuel, who would not meet her eyes this morning. What will happen after spring? He had asked her, and she had not answered him well. And now she understood that his question had not been about her at all. She was 50 yards from the house when she saw Ellis. He was standing in the yard with his arms at his sides and his coat unbuttoned despite the cold, which was the stance of someone who has been waiting and has stopped feeling the temperature. He watched her come up the road with an expression that had nothing of a 15-year-old in it. "You went to town," he said. "For flour?" She lifted the sack slightly. Evidence. He looked at it. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that she recognized. It was the same thing she had seen in Eli's notebook, the same thing she had heard in Samuel's question. The vigilance of children who have been doing the watching in a house where the adult has stopped being able to watch. "Mrs. Tully talks," he said. It was not a question. "She does," Nora said. "She's also the reason I'm here. She posted your father's advertisement." Ellis's jaw tightened. "I know that." "Then you know she did it because she was paying attention." Nora shifted the flour to her other arm. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know things I know, Ellis. That's not a useful way for either of us to proceed." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the yard between them. "He won't talk about it," Ellis said.
His voice had gone flat in the way voices go flat when the only alternative is something a 15-year-old cannot afford in front of a woman he hasn't decided to trust. "I've tried. He sets his face and he won't."
"I know," Nora said. "Eli thinks if he writes everything down—"
He stopped, started again.
"Eli thinks if he can show that we're managing, that we have enough, that the numbers work out." "I know," she said again, more quietly.
"He's 11, Ellis said. He's been doing it since August." Nora stood in the cold yard and looked at this boy who had been cooking for his brothers and buying tobacco he didn't smoke and telling anyone who would listen that they were managing fine. And she felt something move in her chest that was not pity. She had learned enough about this family to know that pity was the wrong instrument. But was something adjacent to it, something that had more respect in it.
"Come inside," she said. "I'll make something hot."
He didn't move immediately. "He's going to be angry that you went to town."
"I expect so."
"He doesn't like—" Ellis stopped.
He doesn't like things going around him. I didn't go around him, Nora said. I went for flour. What I learned while I was there is mine to have learned. She met his eyes. Your father can be angry at me. That's between him and me. That's not your weight to carry.
Something shifted in Ellis Greer's face then. Some tightly held configuration of muscle and responsibility. And for just a moment, he looked his age. Just a moment. Then it closed again, and he nodded and followed her toward the door. Inside, the house was warm. She had banked the stove well before she left, and the warmth had held, and the kitchen smelled of the morning's bread and the wood smoke and the faint, particular smell of a house that has children in it. Eli was at the table with his notebook open. He closed it when she came in, but not quickly, not guiltily, deliberately, as though closing it were a statement rather than a concealment. Samuel was sitting on the floor near the stove, with his knees pulled up and a wooden figure in his hands. He looked up when she came in. He met her eyes. She set the flour down. She unwrapped the salt pork.
She hung her coat on its hook and turned to the stove, and she was in the middle of putting the kettle on when she heard it. Not from upstairs, from the hallway, from the direction of the closed door that was not locked, that she had never tried, that she had been not trying for 7 weeks. A sound. Not a cough this time. A voice. Low, deliberate, directed. Not at itself, not in delirium, but at someone. At the door. She turned. All 3 boys were looking at her, not at each other, at her. And in Eli's face, beneath the calculation and the careful watchfulness, beneath 11 years of keeping records against the chaos of a household coming undone, she saw it clearly for the first time. He had been waiting for her to be ready. The question was whether she was. The voice came again, low, deliberate, shaped like a question or perhaps a command. She could not yet tell which. It passed through the door the way water passes through cracked stone. Not loudly, but with the patient insistence of something that had been moving in one direction for a very long time. Nora did not move immediately. She had learned, in 7 weeks, that the Greer household rewarded stillness. That decisions made in haste in this house left marks that took weeks to smooth over, like dough worked too hard, too fast, collapsing in on itself.
She stood with her hands flat against the table and breathed once, carefully, and looked at the three boys looking back at her. Eli had not moved from his chair. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, with a composure that was entirely too old for his face, and he was watching her with those dark, measuring eyes that had been tallying deficits and surpluses since before she arrived. Samuel had stopped turning his spoon. Tobias had gone very still in the particular way of a child who has learned that stillness is sometimes the only safe response to the world's sudden changes in weather. "Stay here," Nora said. It was not a question. It was not a request. She said it the way she had learned to say most things in this house, plainly, without decoration, with the understanding that the boys were capable of hearing plain things and did not require protection from them. She crossed the kitchen.
The hallway was dark in the way it was always dark in February, the light outside doing its pale, unconvincing best against windows filmed with cold. Nora's hand found the door handle, and she paused there for a moment, with her palm against the wood, feeling the faint warmth of the room beyond. The stove Callum kept burning even when he was too ill to leave his bed, which told her something about the man that she had been carefully filing away against the day she might need it. She knocked once. "Mr. Greer?" A silence, then, "Come in." She opened the door. The room was smaller than she had imagined, which surprised her, though she could not have said what she had imagined. The bed was against the far wall, the stove in the corner, a single window with the curtain drawn back to let in the gray afternoon light, and beside the window, seated in the room's one chair, with a blanket across his lap and a posture that refused to admit defeat, even as it demonstrated the considerable effort required to maintain that refusal, sat Callum Greer. He did not look well. He had not looked well in some time, she suspected, but today the illness had risen to the surface of him in a way that was no longer possible to set aside. His face was drawn. There were shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of nights spent in contest with his own body, and losing. His hands on the blanket's edge were the hands of a man who had spent 30 years with a pick and a mule, and they were very still. On the chair beside him was a sheet of paper. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Sit down," he said finally. There was no second chair. She moved to the edge of the bed and sat, and he did not object, and she understood that this too was a concession of some kind, though she did not know yet what it cost him. "I've been thinking," Callum said, "about Dr. Marsh." Nora said nothing. She had heard about Dr. Marsh from Agnes Tully, who had a great deal to say about him, very little of it flattering. A man of 50 with Eastern education and Western condescension, Agnes had said, who believed Callum Greer's primary problem was the absence of a wife, and said so to anyone who would stand still long enough to listen. Agnes had used the word insufferable with the precision of someone who had been waiting years for the right opportunity to deploy it. "He came by Tuesday," Callum said, "while you were in town." Nora had not known this. "He had a good deal to say." Callum's voice was dry. It was not the dryness of illness, though there was that too. It was the dryness of a man who had been listening to other people's opinions of his life for long enough that he had developed a particular economy of expression when discussing them. "He believes I should remarry. He has believed this for some time. He is not shy about it." "No," Nora said.
I don't imagine he is.
Callum looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not quite amusement, but the distant cousin of it.
He also said that the current arrangement— he paused— that having the woman in the house who is not a wife— that people are talking.
Nora had expected this. She had expected it in the way one expects a particular kind of weather when the light takes on a certain quality in the afternoon. Not with surprise, but with the resigned recognition of something that was always going to arrive.
"What people say," she said carefully, "has not generally been my primary concern."
"No," Callum agreed,
"But it's mine. For the boys."
This was honest, and she respected it. She looked at the sheet of paper beside him and waited. "He left a letter," Callum said. "He's written to a woman in Harlan, a widow. He believes she would be—" He stopped. His jaw tightened briefly and then released. "Suitable." The word landed in the room with the particular weight of words that have been carefully chosen to obscure rather than illuminate. Nora looked at him directly. "And what do you believe?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at his hands, then at the window, then at some middle distance between the two. Outside, the light was doing its slow, indifferent work of retreating toward evening. Somewhere below them, in the kitchen, she could hear the faint sounds of the boys not moving, not speaking, waiting. "I believe," Callum said slowly, "that my sons have not eaten a meal without you at the table since January." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something that neither of them had a clean word for.
"I believe," he continued, "that Eli has not kept his record book in 3 weeks. I know this because I've looked, and because the absence of it is—" He stopped again. His voice had developed an edge that she recognized as the edge of a man approaching territory he did not typically allow himself to enter. "Because the fact that he stopped needing to keep it means something." Nora said nothing. "I believe Samuel slept through the night last Tuesday, for the first time since October." He looked at her now, directly, with an expression that was not comfortable for either of them, but was, she thought, necessary. "I believe these things are not unrelated to your presence here." "Mr. Greer, I am not finished." She closed her mouth. "Dr. Marsh believes you are a solution to a problem," Callum said. "He is not wrong that there is a problem. He is wrong about what the problem is. And he is entirely wrong about what a solution would look like." His voice had steadied. The effort it cost him was visible, but he did not allow it to show in his words. "He sees a household that needs a woman in it. He does not see—" He paused. "He does not see that what this household has needed is someone who stays." Nora felt something shift in her chest. She did not move. "4 housekeepers," Callum said. "I know what they said when they left. I know what I did to make them leave. I have not been—" He stopped. The words were not coming the way he wanted them to, and she could see him wrestling with this, a man who had spent 30 years in a mine learning to be precise about weight and pressure and the exact location of fault lines. "I have not been easy to work for." "No," Nora said. He looked at her. She held his gaze. "No," she said again, more quietly. "But your sons are." Something passed across his face. She watched it move through him the way weather moves across open ground, quickly,
and leaving the landscape altered. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I need to ask you something."
"Yes?"
"Not as your employer," he said this with care, "as a man asking a woman a question that he does not have a right to ask and is going to ask anyway because—" He stopped. "Because Eli has been waiting for me to ask it, and I am tired of making my children wait." Outside, the light had gone to the color of pewter.
Inside, the stove ticked quietly in the corner. "Ask it," Nora said. "Is this—" He looked at his hands. "When spring comes, is this—" He could not quite finish the sentence, and she understood that this was not stupidity or evasion, but the precise difficulty of a man trying to ask something that mattered so much he could not afford to be careless with the words. "I need to know if you intend to stay." Nora sat with the question. She thought about her sister-in-law's spare room with its smell of camphor and obligation. She thought about the wagon ride in December, the snow, the station master's wife's voice carrying its comfortable certainty that Nora would not last the winter. She thought about Samuel's small hand in the bread dough, and Eli's record book with its careful columns of subtraction, and Tobias standing in the hallway deciding whether the kitchen was safe. She thought about a closed door she had never tried, that had not been locked. She thought about what Dr. Marsh saw when he looked at her, which was a solution, a function, a blank space shaped like a wife, which was not the same as being seen at all. She thought about what Callum Greer was asking, which was something different, which was not, "Will you become what I need?" but "Will you remain what you are?" And the distance between those two questions was the distance between a cage and an open field, and she had lived in enough small rooms to know the difference.
"I have not decided," she said.
He looked at her.
"I have not decided,"
she said again, steadily.
"because the decision is mine to make, and I will not make it under pressure from Dr. Marsh or anyone else who has decided what I am for before asking what I want."
She paused.
"But I will tell you this, Mr. Greer. I have not been looking for a reason to leave."
The silence was different now. It had changed its quality entirely, the way a room changes when a window is opened. Not warmer, not yet, but with the distinct possibility of air. Callum looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the careful precision of a man who understood that he had been given something, and that the right response to being given something was not to close his hand around it immediately, but to acknowledge it and wait.
"There's something else,"
he said. His voice had changed. The steadiness was still there, but underneath it something had shifted, something that made Nora go still in a different way.
"Marsh examined me while he was here." He looked at the window. "He was more thorough than the doctor in September."
Nora waited.
"He wants me to go to Lexington," Callum said. "There is a specialist." He paused. "He believes it is—" He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "He believes it is further along than September suggested."
The room was very quiet.
Nora looked at Callum Greer's hands on the blanket, and at his face in the pewter light, and at the sheet of paper beside him that had a woman's name on it from Harlan, a widow, suitable. And she understood with sudden and complete clarity exactly what Dr. Marsh had been arranging and why. and what it meant for the 3 boys sitting in the kitchen below, who had stopped eating until she sat down with them. She stood up. "I'll heat supper," she said. He looked at her. "You'll eat at the table tonight," she said. "With your sons." It was not a question. He seemed to understand this because he did not ask one. She crossed the room. At the door, she paused with her hand on the frame, not quite turning back, looking at the middle distance between the hallway and the room.
"Mr. Greer," she said.
"Yes?"
"The letter from Harlan." She paused. "I would not act on it yet." She left him sitting in the chair with the gray light on his face and the paper beside him, and she walked back down the hall toward the kitchen and the 3 boys who had been waiting. And as she reached the top of the stairs, she heard, behind her, the sound of Callum Greer slowly getting to his feet. The boys had not moved. She had told them to stay at the table, and they had stayed, all 3 of them in a line along the bench like birds on a wire. Samuel closest to the stove with his hands folded in his lap, Eli in the middle with his eyes on the door, Ellis at the far end, pretending to examine something in the grain of the wood. When Nora came down the stairs and into the kitchen, they looked up at her with the particular careful attention of children who have learned that the quality of a moment can be read in an adult's face before a word is ever spoken. She went to the stove and checked the pot. She lifted the lid, set it down, picked up the wooden spoon and stirred. "Is he worse?" Ellis asked. He kept his voice flat and practical, the way he kept most things. "He is about the same," Nora said. "He needs rest, and he needs to stay warm. He needs someone to make sure he eats." She looked at Ellis. "That will be your job in the mornings before the mine. Can you do that?" Ellis looked at her for a moment. "I've been doing it." "I know you have. I'm asking you to keep doing it, but differently. Not leaving the bowl outside the door. Sitting with him." The boy was quiet. Something moved across his face that he did not permit to settle into any identifiable expression. "All right," he said. She ladled soup into 4 bowls and set them on the table, and then, without particular ceremony, sat down herself. It was the first time she had done it at supper. She had been eating after, standing at the counter with her bowl in her hand, the way a person does when they are not sure of their welcome. She did not announce the change. She simply sat. Samuel looked at her bowl, and then at her face, and then picked up his spoon. They ate. The thaw came in the 2nd week of March, tentative at first, the kind that tricks the ground into softening before another freeze locks it again. But by the 3rd week, the creek behind the Greer property was running clear, and the mud in the yard had the deep, sucking quality of earth that has decided to let go of winter. It was Ruth Decker who came on the Thursday. Nora heard the horse before she saw the woman. A deliberate, unhurried sound in the yard, not the quick, purposeful approach of someone delivering news. She looked out the kitchen window and saw a woman of about 45 dismounting with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. The woman tied her horse to the post, looked at the house with a frank and unsentimental gaze, and walked to the door. Nora opened it before she knocked. The woman looked at her. She had a weathered, handsome face, and the kind of eyes that did not waste time on performance. "You're still here," she said. "I am," Nora said. "Good." The woman stepped inside without being invited, which Nora found she did not mind. "Ruth Decker. I'm up the North Road, the ranching property."
I would have come sooner, but I had a difficult February, and I decided if you were the type to leave, you'd be gone before I got here. And if you were the type to stay, there was no emergency."
"Nora Voss," Nora said. "Sit down. I have coffee."
Ruth Decker sat down at the kitchen table and looked around the room with the same frank inventory she had applied to the exterior.
"You've done something with this place," she said. It was not quite a compliment and not quite a statement. It was an observation offered as a form of respect. "It needed doing," Nora said, and poured the coffee.
Ruth wrapped both hands around the cup.
"How is he?" "Improving, slowly." "Dr. Marsh came out?" "3 weeks ago, and again last week."
Nora sat across from her.
"He says the lung is worse than it was in the fall, but not so bad as it might be. He wants him out of the mine."
Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh.
"Callum Greer out of the mine," she said. "That'll be a conversation." "It already was," Nora said.
Ruth looked at her. Something in the woman's expression shifted, not softening exactly, more like a door opening a few inches to see what was on the other side. "You had it with him?" "Someone had to." "And?" Nora considered.
"He listened," she said. "He didn't agree, but he listened."
Ruth was quiet for a moment, turning her cup. "The last woman who worked here, before you, there were several, but the last one who lasted more than a month, she told me he never spoke to her. Not once in 6 weeks. Left money on the table and expected the work to happen around him like weather."
"He speaks," Nora said, "when he has something to say."
"That's more than most people manage." Ruth looked at her steadily. "There's talk in town. You know that."
"I know."
"Agnes Tully is largely responsible for the reasonable version of it. The unreasonable version is being managed by people with nothing better to occupy them." Ruth set down her cup. "I'm telling you this not because I think you should do anything about it, but because I want you to know that there are people who are not fools, and we are watching, and we are not concerned." Nora felt something loosen in her chest that she had not fully recognized as tight.
"Thank you,"
she said. "Don't thank me. It's only common sense." Ruth picked up her cup again. "Now tell me about the boys." Ellis came home from the mine at 4:30. He was 17 and already had the walk of a man who has carried weight, not burdened exactly, but deliberate, each step placed with awareness of what it costs. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw Ruth Decker at the table, and his expression went briefly neutral in the way it did when he was calculating. "Mrs. Decker," he said. "Ellis, you look like your father at that age. It isn't entirely a compliment." Ruth said it without cruelty, and Ellis almost smiled. "Is he up?" Ellis asked Nora.
"He came down for an hour this afternoon. He's resting now."
She handed Ellis a cup without being asked.
"There's bread if you want it."
He took the bread and leaned against the counter rather than sitting, the way he always did when he was not sure how long he meant to stay. But he did not leave, and after a moment he pulled out the chair beside Ruth and sat. Nora watched this without remarking on it. She turned back to the stove. Behind her, she heard Ruth ask Ellis something about the east seam and whether the company had brought in new equipment, and she heard Ellis answer with more words than he usually deployed, his voice losing some of its careful restraint as the subject moved into territory where he felt competent. She listened to them talk and let the sound of it fill the kitchen the way warmth fills a room, not noticed until you realize how long you have been cold. Callum came down for supper. He was thinner than he had been in December, and the cough still visited him in the mornings and sometimes in the evenings, but he moved with more steadiness than he had 3 weeks ago, when she had found him gray-faced in the chair with Dr. Marsh's letter in his hand. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw Ruth Decker, and Ruth looked at him with the particular expression of a person who has known someone long enough to speak plainly. "You look terrible," she said. "Mrs. Decker," he said. "Sit down, Callum. I'm not staying for supper. I told your housekeeper already." She stood and put on her coat.
"I came to see that things were in order." She looked at him with a directness that was neither unkind nor soft. "They are, more than they've been in some time, from what I can see." Callum looked at Nora briefly, then back at Ruth. "She manages," he said. It was not eloquent. Nora, turning to take the bread from the oven, kept her face still. "Yes," Ruth said, "she does." She buttoned her coat. "I'll come again in a fortnight. Nora, if you need anything from town before then, send word with Ott." She left the way she had come, without ceremony, and the kitchen was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of quiet that follows a person of presence. Callum sat down at the table. Eli came in from the back, carrying wood, and Samuel appeared from the hallway where he had been lurking with the dog, and Ellis was already seated, and Nora brought the pot to the table and ladled into each bowl and then sat down in her place. The place she had occupied every evening for the past 3 weeks, the fourth side of the table, across from Callum. He had not commented on it the first night. He had looked at the bowl set before him, and then at her, and then he had picked up his spoon. He did the same now. Samuel said, "The creek is high enough to fish." "Not yet," Eli said. Ott said, "Ott says a lot of things in March that prove wrong by April," Ellis said. Samuel considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old weighing evidence. "But if it were high enough," he said, turning to Nora, "could we?" "If it were high enough, and if your father said so," Nora said. All 3 boys turned to look at Callum. He looked up from his bowl. He looked at Samuel, who was watching him with the particular transparent hope of a child who has not yet learned to conceal wanting. He looked at Eli, who was pretending not to care about the answer. He looked at Ellis, who was looking at his soup. "We'll see," Callum said. It was not yes, but it was not the silence that meant no, and all 3 boys understood the difference, and Samuel turned back to his supper with satisfaction. Later, after the boys were in bed, Nora was banking the stove when she heard Callum's step in the hallway. She had learned his steps over the winter, the careful, slightly effortful tread of a man managing pain and not wanting it witnessed. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and stood there with his hand on the frame, not quite entering. "The letter from Harlan," he said. She set down the poker. "Yes?" "I wrote back." He paused. "I told them I wouldn't be returning to the East Seam, that I'd work surface if they'd have it, or not at all." She looked at him. His face in the lamplight was tired and spare and entirely unreadable, except that she had spent 4 months learning to read what he did not say. "That was the right decision," she said. "It was the only one available to me." He said it without self-pity, just the plain accounting of a man who has measured his circumstances and found them reduced. "The house there are things that need doing. In the spring, the roof above Eli's room
And the porch boards." He stopped. "I'm not asking you to stay and manage it." "I know you're not," she said. The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the creek ran with the sound of the thaw, and somewhere up the ridge an owl called once and was quiet. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Mr. Greer." He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and between them was the whole winter. The meals, and the coughing, and the notebook, and the bread, and the 3 boys who had stopped eating until she sat down with them, and all the small daily negotiations by which 2 people who have each lost something learn to occupy the same space without collision. "I'll have Ellis look at the roof boards tomorrow," he said finally. "I'll hold the ladder," she said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely visible, gone almost before it arrived, but she saw it, and she let it pass without remark, which was, she had come to understand, exactly what he required. He went back down the hall. She heard him on the stairs, the careful step-by-step of a man going slowly but going on his own. She turned back to the stove and finished banking the coals, pressing them together so they would hold through the night and still be warm in the morning when she came down to start the fire again. She stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen with her hands at her sides.
Through the window, the yard was pale with the last of the snow, and the creek was running, and somewhere under the mud the ground was making up its mind about spring. She went to bed.